When people talk about Linux in 2026, it's amazing how often the conversation starts with assumptions that are years, sometimes decades, out of date. If you've used Windows your whole life, especially through Windows 7, Windows 10, and now Windows 11, your idea of an operating system is shaped by a very specific experience. You expect a polished installer, predictable driver support, familiar app ecosystems, and a single company behind everything. And when you look at Linux, you often assume it's the opposite of all that. But here's the thing. Most of what Windows users think they know about Linux is either incomplete, exaggerated, or simply no longer true. One of the biggest misconceptions is that Linux is still only for programmers and terminal wizards. That idea made sense maybe 15 years ago, when installing Linux often meant burning an ISO, manually partitioning your drive, and hoping your Wi-Fi chip was supported. But in 2026, the Linux desktop landscape is radically different. Distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, and Pop!_OS offer installers that are just as simple as Windows. In many cases, they're faster. You boot from a USB, click through a clean graphical wizard, choose your language and time zone, and you're done. You don't need to open a terminal once to get a fully working desktop with a browser, Office Suite, Media Player, and App Store. Yet many Windows users still imagine that Linux requires typing mysterious commands into a black screen. The terminal exists, yes, but so does PowerShell in Windows. The difference is that on Linux, the terminal is a powerful option, not a mandatory requirement. Most everyday tasks can be done through graphical tools. Installing apps, you open a software center. Updating your system, you click Update. Connecting to Wi-Fi, click the network icon. Adjusting display, scaling open settings. It's not some hacker-only playground anymore. Another huge misunderstanding is about software availability. Windows users often say, Linux has no apps. What they usually mean is that Linux doesn't run certain Windows-only programs. And that's true to an extent. You won't natively run some legacy enterprise apps designed only for Windows. But the idea that Linux lacks software in general is just wrong. Browsers like Chrome, Firefox, and Edge all run on Linux. Creative tools like Blender and GIMP are native. Video editors like Kdenlive and DaVinci Resolve support Linux. Developers have access to VS Code, JetBrains, IDEs, Docker, and more. In fact, in 2026, Linux is arguably the dominant platform for development and cloud infrastructure. The confusion often comes from the way Windows users define software ecosystem. On Windows, a lot of apps are tied into Microsoft's ecosystem. Office integrates with OneDrive, Teams integrates with Outlook, and so on. Linux doesn't revolve around a single corporation's services. Instead, it offers multiple ecosystems. You can use LibreOffice, OnlyOffice, or web-based Office. You can sync with Google Drive, Nextcloud, Dropbox. The flexibility is interpreted as fragmentation, but it's actually choice. Gaming is another area where Windows users are stuck in the past. For years, the argument was simple. If you want to game, you need Windows. That used to be almost universally true. But with Valve's investment in Proton and the Steam Deck pushing Linux compatibility forward, the situation has changed dramatically. Thousands of Windows games now run on Linux with minimal effort. Anti-cheat support has improved. Performance in many cases is comparable to Windows and sometimes even better. Are there still titles that don't work? Yes, but the blanket statement that Linux can't game is outdated in 2026. Driver support is another common criticism. Windows users often assume that hardware simply won't work on Linux. This belief comes from real issues in the past. But modern Linux kernels include support for a vast range of hardware out of the box. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, audio, webcams, printers. Most of it just works. GPU support from AMD and Intel is excellent, and NVIDIA support, while historically messy, has improved significantly with better driver packaging and Wayland compatibility. The days of hunting obscure forum posts to get basic hardware functioning are largely over for mainstream devices. Then there's the idea that Linux is unstable or unreliable. Ironically, in server environments, Linux has long been seen as the gold standard of stability. Major websites, cloud providers, and supercomputers rely on Linux. But when it comes to the desktop, Windows users often assume Linux is fragile. In reality, modern Linux distributions are extremely stable. Updates are frequent but controlled. You're less likely to experience forced reboots after updates. You're less likely to have system-wide slowdowns due to background telemetry or bloatware. Many users who switch to Linux are surprised by how consistent the experience feels over time. Another misconception is about security. Some Windows users think Linux is secure because nobody uses it, implying that it's secure through obscurity. That's not accurate. Linux has a fundamentally different permission model, a strong culture of open-source auditing, and a software distribution model that relies on signed repositories rather than random executable downloads from the web that doesn't make it invincible. You can still misconfigure it or fall for phishing attacks, but the security model is different by design, not just by market share. Windows users also tend to underestimate the importance of open source. From their perspective, software is something you buy or download from a company. On Linux, the idea that you can inspect, modify, and redistribute code is central. Even if you personally never look at a single line of code, the fact that thousands of developers can audit and improve it matters. Bugs are found and fixed transparently. Features are discussed in public. There's no mysterious black box deciding your system behavior. That level of transparency is something many Windows users have never experienced. Customization is another area full of misconceptions. Some Windows users think Linux customization is all about flashy themes and spinning cubes. Others think it's too complicated to bother with. The reality is that Linux desktops in 2026 offer both simplicity and depth. You can leave everything as default and enjoy a clean, modern interface. Or you can dive deep and tailor every detail: window behavior, key bindings, tiling layouts, animations, workflows. The choice is yours. It's not customization for the sake of novelty. It's customization for productivity and personal comfort. One subtle but important misunderstanding is about control. On Windows, especially in recent versions, users have noticed increasing system integration with online accounts, mandatory updates, and telemetry. Many assume Linux will be equally intrusive or complex, but Linux distributions typically don't require online accounts to use your system. They don't push ads into your start menu. They don't bundle third-party trial software. The default experience is often cleaner and more respectful of user autonomy. At the same time, some Windows users swing to the opposite extreme and assume Linux is perfect. That's also a misunderstanding. Linux has trade-offs. Certain professional software like Adobe's full Creative Cloud suite still doesn't run natively. Some niche hardware may lack polished drivers. Enterprise environments built entirely around Active Directory and Windows Server can be harder to integrate with a Linux desktop. The point isn't that Linux has no downsides. The point is that many Windows users judge it based on myths instead of real, current limitations. Another big misconception is about fragmentation. Windows users often say there are too many Linux distributions. It's confusing, and yes, there are many distributions. But from a practical standpoint, most mainstream desktop users end up choosing from a handful of popular options. The diversity exists because Linux is modular. Different groups can tailor it for different needs. That doesn't mean you have to try them all. It just means you're not locked into one vision of how your computer should work. Performance is another area where assumptions linger. Some Windows users believe Linux is only good for old hardware, like it's a lightweight fallback system. While Linux does excel at reviving older machines, it's not limited to that. On modern hardware, Linux can be incredibly fast. With fewer background services competing for resources and efficient desktop environments, it often feels more responsive than Windows on the same machine. Boot times, update times, and general system responsiveness can all benefit. There's also a psychological factor. Windows users are used to a certain workflow: the start menu, taskbar, file explorer, control panel evolving into settings. These are ingrained habits. When they try Linux and see something slightly different, like GNOME's overview or KDE's panels, it feels alien. That discomfort is interpreted as complexity or inferiority, but it's often just unfamiliarity. If you dropped a lifelong Linux user into a fresh Windows installation and removed their usual tools, they would feel equally disoriented. Another misunderstanding revolves around support. Windows users assume that because Linux is community-driven, there's no real support. In reality, support comes in different forms. There are massive forums, documentation, wikis, chat communities, and detailed guides. For enterprise users, Companies like Red Hat and Canonical offer paid support with service-level agreements. The model is different, but it's not non-existent. In many cases, community responses are faster and more detailed than official support channels elsewhere. Windows users also tend to conflate Linux with a single desktop environment. They might try one distribution with one interface and assume that's what Linux looks like. But Linux is a kernel. On top of it, you have choices: GNOME, KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, XFCE, and more. Each has its own design philosophy. If one doesn't click with you, another might. Judging the entire Linux ecosystem based on one desktop is like judging all of Windows based on a single third-party shell replacement. In 2026, another misconception is about AI integration. Windows has been pushing AI features deeply into the operating system. Some users assume Linux is lagging behind because it doesn't have a built-in assistant integrated into every corner. But Linux users often prefer modular tools. You can run AI models locally. You can integrate cloud-based AI into your workflow using open tools. The difference is that on Linux, AI is an option you choose, not a feature that's automatically woven into the OS, whether you want it or not. Perhaps the biggest thing Windows users get wrong about Linux is the assumption that it's trying to replace Windows on Windows terms. Linux isn't a clone. It's not a knockoff. It's built around different priorities: openness, modularity, transparency, user control. If you judge it purely by how closely it mimics Windows behavior, you miss what makes it unique. In the end, what Windows users often misunderstand about Linux in 2026 isn't just technical, it's philosophical. They see an operating system as a product delivered by a corporation. Linux is more like a collaborative project than anyone can shape. That difference affects everything from updates to design decisions to community culture. When you approach Linux expecting it to behave exactly like Windows, you'll be frustrated. When you approach it as a different way of thinking about computing, you start to see its strengths. Linux today is not the fragile command-line-only experiment some people remember. It's not the app dessert it was accused of being. It's not automatically incompatible with gaming, modern hardware, or professional workflows. It's a mature, powerful, evolving ecosystem. And the biggest thing Windows users get wrong in 2026 is assuming that Linux is still stuck in the past, when in reality, it has quietly been shaping the future of computing all along.